Assyria has an origination from the 23rd century BC, its earliest king Tudiya being a contemporary of Ibrium of Ebla. It evolved from the Akkadian Empire of the late 3rd millennium BC. Assyria was a strong nation under the rule of Ilushuma, who founded colonies in Asia Minor and raided Isin and other Sumero-Akkadian states in southern Mesopotamia.Under Shamshi-Adad I and his successor Ishme-Dagan. Assyria was the seat of a regional empire controlling northern Mesopotamia and regions in Asia Minor and northern Syria. From 1365 to 1076 BC, Assyria became a major empire and world power, rivaling Egypt. Kings such as Ashur-uballit I, Enlil-nirari, Arik-den-ielan, Adad-nirari, Shalmaneser-I, Tukulti-ninurta-I, Ashur-resh-ishi-I and Tiglath-Pileser-I forged an empire which at its peak stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Caspian Sea, and from the foothills of the Caucasus to Arabia. The 11th and 10th centuries BC were a dark age for the entire Near East, North Africa, Caucasus, Mediterranean and Balkan regions, with great upheavals and mass movements of people. Despite the apparent weakness of Assyria, at heart it in fact remained a solid, well-defended nation whose warriors were the best in the world. Assyria, with its stable monarchy and secure borders, was in a stronger position during this time than potential rivals such as Egypt, Babylonia, Elam, Phrygia, Urartu, Persia and Media. Beginning with the campaigns of Adad-nirari II, Assyria once more became a great power, growing to be the greatest empire the world had yet seen, although some historians do not regard it as a true empire in the modern sense until the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III in the mid-8th century BC. The Assyrian Empire has at times been described as the first military power in history. This article deals with the forces of the Assyrians in the above-described times. Ashurnasirpal II is credited for utilizing sound strategy in his wars of conquest. While aiming to secure defensible frontiers, he would launch raids further inland against his opponents as a means of securing economic benefit, as he did when campaigning in the Levant. The result meant that the economic prosperity of the region would fuel the Assyrian war machine. Ashurnasirpal II was succeeded by Shalmaneser III. Although he campaigned for 31 years of his 35-year reign, he failed to achieve or equal the conquests of his predecessor, and his death led to another period of weakness in Assyrian rule. Assyria would later recover under Tiglath-Pileser III, whose reforms once again made Syria the most powerful force in the Near East, and transformed her into a fully fledged empire, the first of its kind. Later, under Shalmaneser V, Sargon II and Sennacherib, further Assyrian offensives occurred, although these were designed not only for conquest, but also to destroy the enemy's ability to undermine Assyrian power. As such, costly battles raged, taking tolls on Assyrian manpower. Esarhaddon succeeded in taking Lower Egypt and his successor, Ashurbanipal, took the southern upper half of Egypt. However, by the end of the Ashurbanipal's reign it appears that the Assyrian Empire was falling into another period of weakness, one from which she would not escape. It appears that years of costly battles followed by constant rebellions meant that it was a matter of time before Assyria ran out of troops. The loss of the outer regions meant that foreign troops were gone too. By 605 BC, independent political Assyrian records vanished from history and the Assyrians lost their independence forever. Background: Mesopotamia was the site of some of the earliest recorded battles in history. In fact, the first recorded battle was between the forces of Lagash and Umasi. 2450 BC. Like many Mesopotamian records, it contains elements of fiction. The ruler of Lagash, Enatum, was inspired by the god Ningersu to attack the rival kingdom of Umma. The two were involved in minor skirmishes and raids along the respective borders. Enatum, although having triumphed, was struck in the eye by an arrow. After the battle, he proudly documented the behavior of the vultures. Akkadian and Old Assyrian. According to legend, Sargon, the first king of the Akkadian kingdom, was discovered by a gardener in Mesopotamia in a basket. In time, he would found the city of Agade and raise an army of 5,400 men, and then conquer much of modern-day Iraq. His inscriptions boast of 34 victories and 5,400 men eating bread before Sargon, exemplifying both the vast manpower and the obedience of his troops. Though small by the standards of later kings, Sargon's army was larger and more sophisticated than others of the time, utilizing a combination of spears and missile weapons. Bronze swords and four-wheeled chariots brushed aside any resistance as he carved out his empire, which may well have included parts of the Mediterranean, Anatolia and western Iran. Siege warfare was not a problem. Most of the cities that were walled at the time of Sargon were made of mud, and his inscriptions further boast of the destruction he brought on the walls, though he utilized simple tactics that would be later emulated in many states. His dynasty survived for another 125 years. Assyrian, Babylonian and even Persian conquerors would claim to be Sargon's successors and attempt to emulate his great military success. Middle Assyrian. Information on the Assyrian army during this time is difficult to make out. The Assyrians were able to establish their independence on two occasions, during the Old Assyrian Kingdom and the Middle Assyrian Kingdom, with the latter reaching as far as Babylon in the pursuit of conquest. However, military tactics mainly involved using troops raised from farmers who had finished planting the fields and so could campaign for the king until harvest time called for their attention again. The result was that military campaigning was limited to a few months of the year. As a result, our armies could not conquer vast amounts of land without having to rest, and even if they did, they would not be able to garrison conquered lands with troops for long. Organization of the military. The Assyrian army's hierarchy was typical of the Mesopotamian armies at the time. The king, whose rule was sanctioned by the gods, would be the commander of the entire army of the empire. He would appoint senior officers on certain occasions to campaign in his place if his presence on the battlefield could had to be spared. Sargon of Akkad is believed to have created the first standing army. Such feats required food and weapons to be supplied to the army at all times. He is also credited for introducing the composite bow to Mesopotamia as he defeated his Sumerian adversaries. Later on, his successor Shulgi introduced specialized units, grouping missile units and infantry into different smaller groups. Pre-reform. Before the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrian army was also very much similar to the other Mesopotamian armies of the time. Soldiers were mostly raised farmers, who had to return to the fields to collect the harvest. Professional soldiers were limited to a few bodyguards that protected the king and or other nobles and officials, but these would not have been deployed or wasted in battle unless the situation became urgent, as it later did. Assyrian armies could be very large. Shalmaneser III once boasted a force of 120,000 men in his campaigns against Syria. Such a force required men to be extracted from conquered peoples. A large army also needed more food and supplies, and for this the Assyrians organized what they needed for a campaign before they set out. Preparations for a new campaign required required first and foremost the assembly of troops at a designated base. In Assyria, the designated locations included Nineveh, Kalu, or Khorsabad. On some occasions the designated meeting points would change depending upon the campaign. Governors were instructed to accumulate supplies of grain, oil and war material. Other requirements of the governors included calling up the needed manpower. The vassal states were in particular required to present troops as part of the tribute to the Assyrian king, and in good time, failure to do so would have almost certainly been seen as an act of rebellion. The arrival of the king and his bodyguard ended the preliminary stage, and the army would move on to the target of the campaign. The army would march in good order. In the vanguard came the standard of the gods, signifying the servitude of the Assyrian kings to the primary god Ashur. Following this was the king, the humble servant of Ashur, surrounded by his bodyguard with the support of the main chariot divisions and cavalry, the elite of the army. In the rear was the infantry, the Assyrian troops, followed by the conquered peoples. Following this would be the siege train, supply wagons, and then the camp followers. Such a formation would have been very vulnerable to a rear attack. Some columns of troops could travel 30 miles a day, and such speed would have been used to surprise and frighten an opponent into submission. Reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III. Before long, the weaknesses of the Assyrian army soon began to show itself. Battle after battle killed off important soldiers, while the seasons ensured that soldiers returned after a short time to the fields without achieving decisive conquests. By the mid-8th century BC, the Assyrian levy army could not cope with the demands of an empire that often stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. All was to change when Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne in 745 BC. After increasing the efficiency of the Assyrian administration, he went on to change the Assyrian army as well. The most important aspect of his reform was the introduction of a standing army. This included a larger number of foreign soldiers but mixed in with other Assyrian soldiers. These men could be supplied by vassal states as tribute or when demanded by the Assyrian king. They were given Assyrian equipment and uniform which made them indistinguishable from one another, possibly to increase their integration. While the infantry in the standing army contained a large number of foreigners, the Assyrian cavalry and charioteers continued to be dominated by Assyrians. There were exceptions, however, and as casualties mounted, additional troops would not be unwelcome. Sargon II reports that he managed to incorporate 60 Israelite chariot teams into his army. Transportation and communication. With the rise of the Assyrian Empire, new demands were placed on transport and communication. Governing such a vast empire required the attention of the Assyrian king and his administrators. Prior to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, roads in Mesopotamia were little more than well-trodden pathways used by the locals. Over time, a clear path could be made out. However, this was inadequate for an empire whose armies were constantly on the move, repressing one revolt after another. The Assyrians were the first to institute, control and maintain a system of roads throughout their empire. Pony expresses with regular way stations for messengers to rest and/or exchange horses were established. Later, these would form the basis for the Persians to expand this system to their own empire. Rugged mountains were cut through, thus greatly decreasing travel time. Engineers built fine stone pavements leading up to the grand cities of Ashur and Nineveh, so as to impress foreigners with the wealth of Assyria. By the second millennium BC, wooden bridges were built across the Euphrates. By the first millennium BC, Nineveh and Ashur or had stone bridges, testament to the wealth of the kingdom of Ashur. The construction of roads and increased transport meant that goods would flow through the empire with greater ease, thus feeding the Assyrian war effort further. Of course, roads that sped up Assyrian troops would not discriminate and would also speed up enemy troops as well. Use of camels. The Assyrians were the first to use camels as beasts of burden for the military campaigns. Camels were of greater use than donkeys because they can carry 5 times the load and yet require less watering. Camels were not domesticated until shortly before 1000 BC on the eve of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Wheeled vehicles. Traditionally, the Sumerians are credited for inventing the wheel sometime before 3000 BC, although there is increasing evidence to support an Indo-European origin in the Black Sea region of Ukraine. In any case, the Assyrians were the first to manufacture tires of metal, made from copper, bronze and later iron. Metal-covered wheels have the advantage of being more durable. Weapons. Melee weapons, spears consisting of a wooden shaft tipped with a lethal iron spearhead, 5 feet long altogether, iron swords for fight in close range, daggers for slitting throats, javelins to break shields, long-range weapons, slings to throw rocks, bow and arrow range arrows, chariots. The core of the Assyrian army lay in its chariots. Originally these chariots were used as 2-horse vehicles. The ancient Egyptians and Sumerians used war chariots in this fashion as firing mobile platforms or as mobile command platforms. The elevated view would give the generals some ability to see how the troops fared in battle. The Assyrians also used chariots in reconnaissance, carrying messages to and from the front lines as well as for battle. However, the rise of cavalry in the first millennium BC meant that by the 7th century BC, the chariot was demoted to combat duties only. Lighter chariots consisting of 2 to 3 horses were later upgraded under the reign of Ashurnasirpal II to heavy 4-horse chariots. Such chariots could contain more men. Heavier chariots also found new roles, smashing into enemy formations and dispersing the infantry in the process. The Assyrian cavalry and infantry would then be able to exploit the gap and rout the enemy, thereby taking the battlefield. Cavalry were rarely used by the Assyrians or many other Mesopotamians until the 9th century BC, when the use is mentioned during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta II. Before then, many nomads or steppe warriors relied on cavalry, who raided Assyrian lands. The Assyrians had to counter this mobile form of warfare and to beat their opponents at their own game. Perhaps the greatest outside influence is that of the Iranian Medes. It is ironic that the raiding by that people assisted Assyrian attempts in building a cavalry army with which to destroy the kingdom of Elam. However, Assyrian attempts were not without difficulties. Horse archers were used but could not use the bows and the reins of the horses at the same time. As a result, cavalry under Ashurnasirpal are depicted in pairs, with one rider holding both reins and the other shooting with a bow. The Assyrians experienced fewer problems with cavalry when they were deployed as lancers under Tiglath-Pileser III. The Assyrian cavalry continued to be paired of, but this time each warrior holds his own lance and controls their own horse. By the 7th century BC, mounted Assyrian warriors were well armed with a bow and a lance, and armored with lamella armor, while the mounts were equipped with fabric armor, providing limited yet useful protection in close combat and against missiles. Cavalry were to form the core of the later Assyrian armies. Large units of cavalry were required to be deployed by the Assyrians. Some units would consist of hundreds or even of 1,000 horsemen. There is little doubt that without a continuous supply of horses, the Assyrian war machine would have collapsed. As the empire suffered horrendous casualties under Ashurbanipal's campaigns of conquest, the rebellions following his death may have contributed significantly to the downfall of the empire, as fewer vassals were available to pay tribute, horses and other war material needed. Horses were an incredibly important war resource, and the Assyrian king himself took a personal interest in overseeing an adequate horse supply. Three main sources of horses were raids designed to steal horses from opponents, albeit from Scythians or other steppe peoples, tribute paid by vassal states. High-ranking state officers would oversee horse production and report to the king. Horses would be drawn from outlying provinces and brought in to be trained with new recruits for war. Infantry strategy and tactics. Assyrian frontal offensives were designed to shock the enemy and surprise them. However, they were also a strategy employed when time was not on the side. Despite the above, Sargon of Akkad's instinct saved the day, leading his exhausted troops. He launched a surprise attack against his Eurasian opponents, who broke at the speed and surprise of the attack. So vicious was the battle that the Eurasian king abandoned his state officials, governors, 230 members of the royal family, many cavalry and infantry, and even the capital itself. Overall war strategy. The nature of Mesopotamia, plain and fertile with few natural defenses, meant that defensive operations were out of the question. Only a decisive attack could defend such vulnerable yet valuable locations. The cities of Ashur and Nineveh were both sandwiched between rivers, Nineveh being more so enclosed and protected by the Tigris, while being close to the Tigris, was a fair distance away from the Euphrates. The result was that both cities had a measure of natural protection. However, rivers would not stop a determined army, so attacking and destroying the enemy's ability to wage war was the best method of ensuring survival. To this end, the Assyrians sought a decisive encounter that would destroy the enemy's army. Colonization. The Assyrians, in conjunction with the deportation, would also send some of their own into foreign lands and settle them as colonists. The primary aim was to establish a loyal power base. Taxes, food and troops could be raised here as reliably as at the homeland, or at least it must have been hoped. Furthermore, the presence would bring innumerable benefits: resistance to other conquerors, a counter to any rebellions by the natives, and assist the provincial Assyrian governors in ensuring that the vassal state was loyal to Assyria. Total destruction. One must be careful before assuming that the Assyrians utilized total war. However, it is known that the Assyrians, as part of their overall strategy of weakening their opponents and of exacting revenge, would violently destroy what they could not take back or could not consolidate. Psychological warfare. The Assyrians fully appreciated the use of terrorizing their enemies, to conserve manpower and rapidly move on to solve Assyria's multiple problems. The Assyrians preferred to accept the surrender of their opponents, or else destroy their ability to resist a surrender. This in part explains their offensive strategy and tactics. Deportations. It is not known if the Assyrians were the first to deport people, although since none before had ruled the Fertile Crescent as they did, it is likely that they were the first to practice it on a large scale. The Assyrians began to utilize mass deportation as a punishment for rebellions since the 13th century BC. The purposes of deportation included, but were not limited to, 1. Psychological warfare. The possibility of deportation would have terrorized the people. 2. Integration. A multi-ethnic population base in each region would have curbed nationalist sentiment, making the running of the empire smoother. 3. preservation of human resources. Rather than being butchered, the people could serve as slave labor or as conscripts in the army. By the 9th century BC, the Assyrians made it a habit of regularly deporting thousands of restless subjects to other lands. Resettling these people in the Assyrian homeland would have undermined the power base of the Assyrian Empire if they rebelled again. As a result, Assyrian deportation involved removing one enemy population and settling them into another. Below is a list of deportations carried out by Assyrian kings. 744 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III deports 65,000 people from Iran to the Assyrian-Babylonian border at the Diyala River. 742 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III deports 30,000 people from Hamath, Syria and into the Zagros Mountains in the east. 721 BC, Sargon II deports 27,290 people from Samaria, Israel and disperses them throughout the empire. However, it is likely that his ousted predecessor Shalmaneser V ordered the deportation. 707 BC, Sargon II deports 108,000 Chaldeans and Babylonians from the Babylonian region. 703 BC, Sennacherib deports 208,000 people from Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III reintroduced deportation on a grand scale, deporting tens, even hundreds of thousands of people. Deportations were also coupled with colonization. See above for more details. Dealing with rebels.